Welcome to Inspirational True Stories. Looking for the hottest stories, engaging discussions, and viral moments from Reddit? You've come to the right place. At Trend Reddit, we bring you the latest trends, weird confessions, and shocking revelations shared by Reddit communities around the world. Imagine this: have you ever read a story that was so surprising, so impressive, that it stuck with you forever? That's the kind of content we bring you. So subscribe, like the videos, and join our community by sharing your thoughts. What's the most memorable story you've ever seen on Reddit? Let us know in the comments below, and let's explore the world of Reddit. Tara Lawson paused outside the bustling hallway of St. Augustine Medical Center, letting the steady hum of beeping machines and soft murmurs wash over her. A seasoned medical director in her early 40s, Tara had returned to her nursing roots for the day to fill a temporary gap. Despite the high rank on her badge, she blended seamlessly into the sea of white uniforms, her movements calm and purposeful as she glid. Today was not about titles or prestige, it was about the patients. Tara prided herself on the belief that every role in a hospital mattered equally, from the janitors to the surgeons. Her quiet confidence radiated as she settled into a station, eyes trained on the patient charts, each one a story of its own. She leaned over the records, a small smile on her face as she focused on deciphering the messy scrawl of prescriptions and treatments, unhurried and meticulous. Then came a brusque cough behind her. Tara glanced up to find Dr. Samuel Hughes towering over her, his expression set in a condescending smirk. He was a tall man in his mid-50s with sharp eyes that held a permanent look of disdain, especially for those he considered beneath him. Dr. Hughes was known across the hospital for his brilliance as much as his arrogance. Nurses were just another rung in the ladder, a necessary but often dismissed presence in his world. "Can you grab the patient's file for room 201? He ordered, voice crisp with authority, without so much as a glance at her badge. To him, she was simply a nurse standing in his way. Tara's fingers tightened slightly around the chart she was holding, but her composure remained steady. "Of course, doctor," she replied, her tone steady and polite, even as his dismissive gaze brushed past her. Dr. Hughes barely acknowledged her response, instead launching into a rapid-fire list of tasks for her to complete. He didn't wait for confirmation or even a nod, just turned his back to her, assured she would follow his commands. Tara watched him stride away, the sharp scent of his aftershave lingering in the air as she exhaled a quiet sigh. With each order, Tara felt the sting of his assumptions. It wasn't the tasks themselves that bothered her; she'd done each one 1,000 times before in her career. It was the unspoken dismissal in his tone, the clear belief that her only purpose here was to follow his lead. As she resumed her work, her mind wandered to the layers of bias woven into everyday hospital life. How many doctors saw nurses this way, as mere functionaries, and how much of her own success had been possible because she'd learned to rise above it. She was here to observe, to help, and perhaps, without meaning to remind certain individuals that respect shouldn't be reserved only for those with lofty titles. Later that afternoon, Tara found a quiet moment to call her close friend Janelle. "You wouldn't believe what happened today," she began, recounting the encounter in hushed, amused tones. Janelle, with her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude, listened quietly before offering advice. "Sounds like a classic case of inflated ego. You're going to let him talk to you like that?" Janelle's voice held a hint of challenge. Tara's laughter was soft but tinged with resignation. "Oh, I'm used to it. Patience, my dear. Sometimes the best way to handle arrogance is to let it reveal itself." St. Augustine Medical Center was more than just a hospital. It was a fortress of prestige, nestled in the heart of the city, and known for attracting only the most skilled, and often, the most ambitious professionals in medicine. Its sleek glass exterior and sprawling lobbies reflected a polished, high-stakes environment where patients and staff alike felt the weight of expectations. Inside, the halls buzzed with the kind of urgency that left little room for pleasantries, and the hospital's strictly hierarchical culture only added to the intensity. Here, doctors led, administrators managed, and nurses followed. In this hierarchy, few embodied its ethos quite like Dr. Samuel Hughes. In his crisp white coat and polished shoes, Dr. Hughes was practically a fixture, well known for his expertise in cardiothoracic surgery and his knack for flaunting that expertise whenever possible. He had built a reputation on the operating table and, more notably, on his unyielding arrogance. To him, status and skill were inseparable. He viewed himself as the hospital's backbone, and while he was undoubtedly gifted, his disdainful attitude left no question of his belief in his own superiority. The staff knew Hughes all too well. He swept through the corridors with the brisk, confident air of a man who owned the place. seldom making eye contact with anyone he deemed unworthy of his attention. Nurses were frequently on the receiving end of his sharp, impatient orders, and few dared to question him. He had a talent for silencing opposition, leaving little room for any voices that didn't align with his own. Dr. Hughes's colleagues accepted his dismissiveness as a given, perhaps a quirk that accompanied his skill. After all, he saved lives, and in their eyes, that fact alone excused his attitude. Yet among the nurses, he was the topic of countless quiet, frustrated conversations during breaks. They bore the brunt of his quick temper and his tendency to reduce their contributions to mere assistance, even though they often played a critical role in patient recovery. So when Hughes encountered Tara that morning, it was routine for him to issue commands without a second thought. She was, in his eyes, simply another nurse to direct, another cog in the complex machine that he felt he controlled. His eyes barely registered her beyond the simple uniform, and his words, clipped and devoid of warmth, conveyed his assumptions clearly. Yet Tara's reaction was unexpected. Where most nurses might have tensed or offered a strained response, she remained completely composed, answering him with a calm, almost serene tone. She exuded an authority so subtle that it barely registered with Hughes, who was too engrossed in his own world to notice. For him, the brief interaction was forgotten as soon as it ended, a mundane moment in his busy day. But for Tara, the encounter lingered not because of any personal affront, but as a stark reminder of the pervasive attitude woven into the hospital's culture. She'd encountered men like Hughes before, men who believed their titles granted them free rein to belittle others, and she knew all too well the damage that unchecked arrogance could cause. As she continued her shift, moving quietly through the hospital's corridors, Tara's presence seemed to offer a quiet contrast to the bustling, high-energy environment around her. She was at once invisible and quietly powerful, a steady force in a place that seldom acknowledged humility as strength. Hughes may not have realized who she truly was, but his ignorance would not go unnoticed for long. Tara moved through the rest of her shift with her usual grace, unfazed by Dr. Hughes' earlier behavior. She kept her focus sharp, her attention locked on the patients and their needs. Yet the shadow of Hughes' dismissive tone lingered at the edge of her mind. She'd grown accustomed to this kind of treatment in her years of medical work. Still, it never failed to remind her of the culture she wanted to help change. Later that afternoon, as she bent over a patient's chart, her concentration was broken by the sharp click of approaching footsteps. Dr. Hughes was back, his gaze flicking briefly over her before landing on the chart she was holding. "I need those notes," he demanded, his tone clipped and impatient. Without waiting for her response, he reached over, taking the file from her hands, as if she were simply a fixture in the background, no more significant than the equipment lining the walls. Tara took a steadying breath, allowing herself a brief pause before responding. "Of course, doctor," she replied, her voice calm and unfailingly polite. She met his gaze for a moment, her eyes steady, holding the weight of unspoken words that Dr. Hughes, oblivious to her true role, failed to recognize. He gave a dismissive nod, his attention already shifting as he muttered instructions over his shoulder. "Make sure you're available for patient rounds later." "I don't want to be held up," he said, sounding almost bored. His words hung in the air like a brush off, barely registering Tara's presence as anything more than another nurse on duty. Tara watched him walk away, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She didn't need to challenge him outright. She knew that soon enough, his perception of her would be upended. But she had no intention of changing the way she handled herself to match his attitude. Her quiet resilience was her strength, a trait she'd cultivated over years of navigating environments filled with people just like him. Once Hughes was out of sight, Tara headed to the break room where a group of nurses were gathered, their tired faces lighting up as she entered. They'd all seen her encounter with Hughes, and their hushed whispers faded as she joined them. One of the senior nurses, Karen, glanced at Tara with an amused look. "Dr. Hughes really has no idea, does he?" she said, a grin spreading across her face. The medical director herself mistaken for just another nurse. A ripple of laughter filled the room, mingled with admiration. The staff had always respected Tara for her humility and dedication, but witnessing her brush off Hughes' arrogance without a hint of offense had only deepened their respect. They knew who she was, and seeing her step into their shoes with no air of superiority was a powerful reminder of her character. Tara smiled, brushing off their comments with a quiet laugh. "I didn't mind it," she replied, shrugging lightly. "Sometimes people reveal more about themselves than they intend to." Her words lingered in the air, simple yet profound. To the nurses, Tara was more than a boss. She was a reminder that true leadership meant understanding and respect. and though Hughes remained blissfully ignorant of her true role, his behavior had already set something in motion, sparking a silent, powerful unity among the staff. But even as she left the break room, Tara knew the moment of revelation would come soon enough. The wheels were already turning, and Dr. Hughes was about to learn a lesson he would not easily forget. That evening, as the lights of the city flickered on outside her window, Tara sank into her armchair, letting the day's events play back in her mind. She had spent hours listening to the steady beeps of monitors, guiding patients through their fears, and stepping in wherever she was needed. Yet it was Dr. Hughes' behavior that lingered, a reminder of how ingrained biases were in even the most reputable institutions. She pulled out her phone and dialed her close friend Janelle, who picked up after just one ring. Well, if it isn't my favorite medical director. Janelle's voice was warm and lively, her energy an immediate balm to Tara's weariness. How was the grand experiment of blending in today? Tara let out a small, exasperated laugh. Let's just say I met one of the best examples of why I wanted to make a difference here. She described her interactions with Dr. Hughes, his dismissive tone, and his complete disregard for her position, all because he assumed she was just another nurse. Typical, Janelle sighed, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. How many times have we seen it? You'd think a man like that would understand respect, but he's clearly lost in his own ego. Tara leaned back, letting her head rest against the chair. Exactly. But I didn't even mind him treating me that way. It's just disappointing. He's brilliant, Janelle, but that brilliance is shadowed by arrogance. It's almost like he's forgotten what it means to work with others, not just lead them. Janelle chuckled softly, but her tone held a hint of steel. You're too forgiving, Tara. If I were you, I'd have set him straight right there in the hallway, just to watch the look on his face. Oh, I know you would have, Tara replied, a smirk playing on her lips. But there's a certain satisfaction in letting someone's actions speak for themselves. Hughes doesn't need me to remind him of my title. He'll see it for himself soon enough, and maybe he'll think twice next time. Janelle paused, then sighed. You always were the patient one. Still, if anyone can handle this with grace, it's you. Just don't let him trample over you. You've worked too hard to be dismissed like that. I know, Janelle, believe me, I do, but I also believe that real change comes from showing, not telling. He's about to get a lesson in humility, and I don't have to say a single word, Tara replied, her voice soft yet resolute. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with mutual understanding. Janelle, who had been Tara's confidante through countless career moves and challenges, knew that Tara's approach, though subtle, was often more powerful than direct confrontation. She'd seen it before. Tara's strength was in her quiet resilience, her ability to make people reflect on their actions without ever raising her voice. All right, Mezzo, let actions speak for themselves, Janelle finally said, the humor back in her voice. But call me as soon as Hughes finds out who you really are. I want every detail. I live for moments like this. Tara laughed, feeling a warmth spread through her. You'll be the first to know, I promise. And trust me, I don't think he'll forget it. They exchanged goodbyes, and as Tara set down her phone, a sense of calm washed over her. She felt ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that her quiet, steady presence would be the force that spoke the loudest. And when the time came, Dr. Hughes would see her not as an invisible figure beneath him, but as the leader she truly was. The next morning, the break room was buzzing with chatter and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The night shift nurses were wrapping up, trading stories with the incoming day shift about difficult patients, humorous moments, and, of course, the latest gossip. But today, the topic on everyone's mind was Dr. Hughes and his latest encounter with the new nurse, Tara. She handled him so well, one nurse said, shaking her head in admiration. I was there when he started ordering her around, and she didn't even flinch. Just stayed calm and kept doing her job like he didn't even bother her. Exactly. Another nurse chimed in, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and amusement. I don't know how she did it. I would have snapped if he talked to me that way. As the room filled with laughter, Karen, one of the senior nurses who had worked at the hospital for nearly 2 decades, entered with a knowing smile. She was one of the few who knew Tara's true identity, and she couldn't help but chuckle as she listened to the others' reactions. There's a reason she was so calm, Karen said, raising an eyebrow as she sipped her coffee. The other nurses turned to her, curiosity gleaming in their eyes. Tara Lawson isn't just another nurse, as Dr. Hughes might think. The room fell silent. Confused looks passed between the nurses as they waited for Karen to continue. She's our medical director, Karen revealed, her voice tinged with pride. That's right, Dr. Tara Lawson. She's been in charge for over a year now. The board hired her to turn things around here, to help us create a more supportive environment. She's here to work with us, not above us, and that's exactly why she's filling in as a nurse." Gasps and murmurs of surprise filled the room, and a few jaws even dropped. The nurses exchanged incredulous glances, processing the revelation with a mixture of respect and newfound admiration. Tara, the calm, unassuming woman who had shown such humility and patience, was in fact their boss, a leader who had chosen to work by their side rather than from a distance. "Are you serious?" one of the younger nurses asked, her eyes wide with amazement. "I thought she was just, I don't know, someone filling in for the week." Karen chuckled, nodding. "Oh, she's filling in, all right. But it's not just for the experience. She wants to understand what we go through every day to really feel what it's like on the ground. I think she believes that to make real changes, she has to be right here with us." The nurses shared a moment of quiet reflection. They realized how rare it was to have someone in a leadership position who genuinely valued their work and wanted to understand it firsthand. The respect they felt for Tara deepened, mingling with a new sense of camaraderie. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was one of them. As they gathered their belongings and prepared for the shift change, whispers of excitement and admiration continued to ripple through the group. Some of them couldn't help but laugh, imagining the look on Dr. Hughes' face when he finally realized who Tara was. "Well," one nurse said with a grin, "Dr. Hughes is in for a surprise." They all chuckled, nodding in agreement. There was a new energy among them, a shared understanding that their leader wasn't some distant figure behind a desk, but someone who valued and respected their work enough to step into their shoes. It was empowering, a reminder that they were more than just the roles assigned to them by others. And as the shift began, each nurse moved through their tasks with a little more pride, a little more confidence. They knew that, despite the hierarchy that Dr. Hughes so often enforced, they had a champion in Tara, a leader who saw them, valued them, and stood by them in ways that words couldn't capture. The day would unfold with its usual challenges, but they were ready, knowing that Tara's quiet strength was woven into every step they took. As Dr. Hughes strolled into the staff lounge later that day, he wore the self-assured grin that seemed permanently etched onto his face. He glanced around, catching sight of a colleague, Dr. Mark Turner, another senior physician with whom he occasionally shared the latest happenings in the hospital hierarchy. "Turner," Hughes called, his voice carrying an air of casual arrogance. "You should have seen the new nurse this morning. Just another one of those quiet types. But she seemed a bit too comfortable standing around in my way." Turner, used to Hughes' frequent complaints about the nursing staff, nodded politely, barely looking up from his coffee. But Hughes, eager to relay his encounter, continued with a smirk. "You know, I had to practically spell out instructions for her," he scoffed, leaning against the wall. "She's the type that thinks she knows what she's doing, didn't question a thing. But I could tell she was trying to keep up appearances. Honestly, she's lucky I didn't send her off to another ward." Turner raised an eyebrow, finally looking up, somewhat amused. "So did she do anything wrong, or was she just quiet?" Hughes shrugged, clearly missing the subtle point of Turner's question. "Nothing wrong, I suppose. Just a bit of a mystery why they bring in people like that doesn't add anything to the team dynamic. I have to watch these nurses so carefully, Turner. They don't understand the importance of my work. They just see it as tasks to complete." Turner gave him a mild look. "Maybe she's just new. Besides, they're under a lot of stress, just like the rest of us." But Hughes waved him off, unaffected by any hint of empathy. "Look, I respect them for what they do. But let's not pretend they're doing any heavy lifting. They're here to assist, and that's it. Some of them get too big for their scrubs, if you know what I mean. We're the ones who call the shots." Turner sipped his coffee, watching Hughes with a bemused expression. "I'm sure you put her in her place," he said, his tone dry. "Of course," Hughes replied with a satisfied nod. "She was quiet enough, but I doubt she'll get in my way again. I expect she'll think twice before standing around when there's work to be done." He chuckled, pleased with his own assessment, still blissfully unaware of the truth about Tara's identity. Unbeknownst to him, several nurses who had overheard snippets of his conversation exchanged knowing glances. They stifled their laughter, a silent camaraderie growing among them, as they imagined the inevitable moment when Hughes would learn who Tara really was. His arrogance had blinded him, leaving him unaware of the respect Tara commanded not just among the nurses but throughout the hospital. It was as if he'd constructed his own reality, one in which he remained unchallenged, unquestioned. After Hughes left, Turner stayed behind, unable to resist a small smile. He'd heard enough to know there was more to the new nurse than Hughes realized. Turner had caught wind of Tara's reputation, her quiet leadership, her hands-on approach to managing the hospital's team, her genuine respect for every staff member. Unlike Hughes, he understood that true leadership was more than simply giving orders. And he wasn't alone. Across the hospital, word of Tara's position was spreading like wildfire. Hughes' ignorance had turned into a sort of running joke, a shared secret that brought the staff together. They knew that the truth would eventually surface, that Dr. Hughes' smug assumptions would soon meet the cold light of reality. For now, they let him carry on, secure in his bubble of arrogance. But that bubble was fragile, and it wouldn't take much to burst it. The boardroom was bright and sterile, with the quiet hum of the central air conditioning filling the silence. Dr. Hughes walked in confidently, his gaze sweeping over the long, polished table where several members of the hospital management were already seated. He gave a polite nod, though his attention lingered on the head of the table, wondering who would be leading today's meeting. Moments later, the door opened again, and Tara entered, her calm presence seeming to command the room without a word. She moved to the front of the table, her gaze level and composed, meeting each person's eyes, lingering just a moment longer when she looked at Hughes. He sat upright, an initial flicker of confusion crossing his face as he processed her presence there at the head of the table, with the attention of the entire management team on her. "Good afternoon, everyone," Tara began, her voice steady and warm. "I appreciate you all gathering here today. There are a few matters we need to discuss regarding the hospital's standards for teamwork and mutual respect, especially in how we work with our nursing staff." Dr. Hughes's face barely concealed his irritation. He glanced around, shifting in his seat, still puzzled by her presence. Then it hit him. He blinked, an involuntary, almost imperceptible movement, as he began to realize who she was. Tara Lawson wasn't just a temporary nurse filling in for the day, she was the hospital's medical director. His medical director. Tara's gaze moved to him as she continued, her tone calm but carrying a quiet authority that left no room for doubt. "I had the opportunity to experience our team's environment from a new perspective these past few days. What I encountered reminded me of how crucial it is that every role here is respected. Respect isn't optional, and it isn't determined by title, it's a necessity, especially in our line of work." Dr. Hughes swallowed, his confidence suddenly wavering. The weight of his assumptions pressed down on him, each memory of his dismissive words to Tara now sharp and cutting. He opened his mouth to respond, but her words continued, firm and unyielding. "In a hospital of this caliber, where we pride ourselves on excellence, there's no place for condescension or arrogance. Every member of our staff contributes to patient care, and each deserves recognition for their dedication," she said, her gaze steady on Hughes. "Dr. Hughes, your recent interactions with the nursing team and myself have highlighted the need for some adjustments in our approach." Hughes felt his face grow warm, a flush of embarrassment that he couldn't suppress. "Ms. Lawson, Dr. Lawson," he stammered, his tone uncharacteristically meek, "I wasn't aware that well. I didn't mean." Tara gave him a small, composed smile, holding up a hand. "I understand, Dr. Hughes. But intentions matter less than actions. If our goal is to provide exemplary care, we must foster a culture of respect and empathy. That starts with each of us, especially those in leadership positions." She let her words hang in the air, her message unmistakably clear. The board members exchanged approving glances, nodding in agreement with her words. Tara's leadership was evident not only in her role but in her ability to address difficult issues without anger or blame. She was simply laying down the standards that everyone, including Hughes, needed to follow. As the meeting concluded, Hughes mumbled a stammered apology, the sting of his own hubris now apparent to everyone in the room. The confidence he usually wore like armor felt suddenly flimsy, his arrogance exposed for what it was. Tara gathered her notes, nodding politely to him as she left the room. She didn't need his apology, nor did she relish his discomfort. She had done what was necessary for the hospital, for the staff, and for the patients. And as she walked away, she knew that the change she'd sought was already beginning to take root. In the days following the boardroom confrontation, the atmosphere at St. Augustine Medical Center began to shift. Tara's words had left a lasting impression, not just on Dr. Hughes but on everyone who had been present. A quiet determination filled the hospital halls, as though the staff understood that a new chapter was beginning, one rooted in respect and collaboration. True to her word, Tara moved quickly to enact policy changes designed to foster a culture of inclusivity and mutual respect. One of the first initiatives was a series of mandatory workshops on communication and bias in the workplace, aimed at building awareness of the subtle, often unintentional ways that biases could influence interactions. In a hospital email, Tara outlined the goals of the new program. She emphasized that the training was not meant to punish but to strengthen the team, to remind everyone from the doctors to the janitorial staff that their contributions were valued. The email closed with a simple but powerful statement: Our strength lies not in our titles, but in our commitment to each other and our patients." The response from the staff was overwhelmingly positive. Nurses, who had long borne the brunt of the hierarchical divide, felt seen and heard for the first time in years. For some, it was a relief to know that their hard work was finally being recognized. For others, it was inspiring, a reminder that leadership could, in fact, be compassionate and just. Dr. Hughes, however, found the changes harder to embrace. Attending the mandatory training sessions felt like a subtle reminder of his misstep, and his pride made it difficult to fully engage. But over time, he noticed a difference in how his colleagues interacted. Conversations that had once been hurried or brusque now held a bit more patience, a bit more empathy. One day, as he left a training session, Dr. Hughes found himself lingering in the hallway, watching as a young nurse patiently explained a procedure to a new resident. The respect in her tone, the gentle encouragement in her words, it reminded him of Tara's calm, unflinching gaze in the boardroom, the way she had stood before him with the kind of quiet authority that could only come from genuine respect for others. Slowly, he began to reconsider his own approach. He started small, making it a point to greet the nurses in the morning, to acknowledge their efforts and thank them for their work. It felt strange at first, even awkward, but he couldn't deny the impact. Over time, he noticed a difference in how the staff responded to him. The nurses seemed more open, the atmosphere less tense. Little by little, his own perspective began to shift. Meanwhile, Tara continued leading by example. She spent time with every department, listening to concerns, discussing ways to improve, and making sure each member of the staff felt valued. Her humility and dedication inspired others to do the same. The hospital began to feel less like a hierarchy and more like a community, a place where every role was acknowledged and appreciated. Soon, respect first became more than just a slogan, it was the foundation of St. Augustine's culture. Staff members adopted the phrase as a kind of unspoken motto, a reminder of Tara's commitment to the people behind the roles. The shift in the hospital was subtle yet powerful, and it didn't take long for patients and their families to notice, too. They saw it in the way nurses spoke to doctors, in the extra time staff took to reassure them, and in the overall warmth of the care they received. And although Hughes would never say it outright, he knew Tara's influence was behind it all. He had come to respect her, not just as the medical director, but as a leader whose actions spoke louder than words. Tara's policies had transformed the hospital, but her presence, her quiet resilience had left an impact that went far beyond any training session. St. Augustine was changing, one respectful interaction at a time, and Tara knew that the work they were doing would endure. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing she had helped create something meaningful and lasting in a place where so many lives depended on compassion and respect. The weeks after the policy changes felt like a turning point for Dr. Hughes, though he'd never admit it openly. At first, he had treated the mandatory training sessions as a chore, a checkbox on a long list of duties. He attended with a stiff jaw and crossed arms, silently calculating the hours until he could return to his office. But gradually, as each session unfolded, something in him began to soften. One particular workshop session stayed with him. It was an exercise on empathy designed to place participants in each other's shoes, quite literally. He and a few other doctors had been paired with nurses, swapping roles and enacting situations where they could feel the challenges and pressures that each team member faced. He had partnered with a young nurse, Leah, who led him through a scenario of patient care under tight schedules and unpredictable demands. Watching her seamlessly prioritize tasks, Hughes found himself genuinely impressed. Later that day, as he walked through the halls, Hughes began to notice things he hadn't before. He saw the way nurses responded with patience to anxious family members, the way they noticed the smallest changes in their patients' conditions before anyone else. There was a quiet, powerful diligence in their work that he had once dismissed as routine. One afternoon, Hughes approached Leah at the nurse's station. His voice was hesitant, almost uncharacteristically soft. "I wanted to thank you for the session today," he said, meeting her eyes. "I never realized how challenging it could be. You handle it all with a level of dedication I didn't see before." Leah smiled, taken aback but appreciative. "Thank you, Dr. Hughes. It means a lot coming from you." That simple exchange sparked a series of small but significant changes in Hughes. He started to observe, to listen more closely. The nurses began to see a shift in him, as well gone was the brusque, impatient doctor who had once ordered them around without a second glance. In his place was a man who seemed genuinely interested in their work, who made an effort to ask questions, to acknowledge their expertise. The transformation wasn't immediate, it was gradual, a process that unfolded with each passing day. Hughes would catch himself before making a dismissive comment, remind himself to thank the team after each successful surgery, and even offer to help in situations where he once would have walked away. It was as though Tara's presence lingered in every interaction, an invisible reminder that respect went both ways. One day, as Hughes rounded a corner, he saw Tara speaking to a group of interns. She looked up, catching his gaze, and gave him a warm, encouraging smile. In that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude, realizing that her quiet leadership had taught him more than any medical textbook or years of experience ever had. In time, Dr. Hughes's own transformation became part of St. Augustine's story. His former arrogance was now the subject of gentle teasing, a reminder of the man he had once been. The nurses would occasionally share stories of the old Dr. Hughes with new staff, and Hughes would join in with a self-deprecating chuckle, acknowledging how far he had come. But it wasn't just the hospital staff who noticed. Patients sensed the change, too. They saw it in the warmth with which he greeted them, in the extra time he spent explaining procedures and answering their questions. For the first time in his career, Hughes felt a deep, genuine connection with the people he treated, and it filled him with a sense of purpose he had never known before. Dr. Hughes had become a respected figure at St. Augustine, not for his skill alone, but for his compassion, his humility, and his willingness to grow. He knew he owed much of it to Tara, and the example she had set not by reprimanding him, but by inspiring him to see beyond himself. As the months rolled by, the effects of Tara's leadership rippled far beyond the walls of St. Augustine Medical Center. News of her transformative approach spread, drawing attention from medical professionals across the region. Hospital staff who once felt overlooked or undervalued began sharing their stories of newfound respect, collaboration, and unity under Tara's guidance. Healthcare organizations took note. Articles were published, highlighting St. Augustine's shift toward a more inclusive culture, one where every role was acknowledged as essential. Tara became a quiet icon for leadership that was rooted in compassion rather than hierarchy, in empathy rather than ego. Invitations started pouring in from other hospitals, conferences, and medical institutions, asking her to speak about the changes she had spearheaded and the values she upheld. At first, Tara hesitated, reluctant to leave the hospital for even a day. But the encouragement from her staff and the board, who had witnessed her impact firsthand, convinced her that sharing her experience might inspire others to create similar transformations in their own workplaces. In her first speaking engagement, Tara addressed a packed auditorium. She spoke of her experience stepping into the role of a nurse, the humbling perspective it gave her, and the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed in healthcare. Her words were simple but filled with conviction, resonating deeply with everyone in the room. She didn't focus on herself but rather on the universal need for respect and empathy within the medical field. She emphasized that leadership was not about commanding from above but about understanding, listening, and lifting others up. The speech struck a chord. Doctors, nurses, and administrators from hospitals around the state left the auditorium inspired, many with plans to implement their own inclusivity programs, workshops on empathy, and initiatives to bridge the gaps between roles. Tara's approach became a model, and other leaders began reaching out to her, eager to learn how they could foster a similar environment of mutual respect in their institutions. Meanwhile, back at St. Augustine, the staff continued to feel the effects of her influence. The once clear divide between roles softened, replaced by an environment where collaboration came naturally. Doctors worked alongside nurses, nurses guided residents, and even administrative staff felt more connected to the patients they served. The respect-first culture Tara had championed now seemed woven into the very fabric of the hospital. One afternoon, Hughes stood in the break room, listening to a group of young doctors and nurses discussing a challenging case. They shared ideas freely, their titles forgotten in the camaraderie of problem-solving. Hughes caught himself smiling, remembering his own initial resistance to change, to the vulnerability required to let go of ego. He knew that Tara's influence had led him to this moment, had helped him grow in ways he hadn't thought possible. The broader community began to notice St. Augustine's changes as well. Patients felt the difference too. They saw it in the way the staff worked together, the warmth and openness that greeted them at every turn. Stories spread of how well they were treated, of doctors who took time to listen, and nurses who went above and beyond. St. Augustine's reputation soared, not just for its quality of care but for its dedication to a culture of kindness and respect. As the months turned to years, Tara continued to balance her work at St. Augustine with her speaking engagements, her influence gradually extending to countless other medical institutions. Despite the recognition, she remained grounded, focusing on her staff, her patients, and the small, everyday moments where true change often began. In her quiet, resilient way, Tara had not only reshaped St. Augustine but had sparked a movement toward compassionate leadership in healthcare. And for every hospital that adopted her approach, for every patient who felt a little more heard, Tara's impact continued to grow, a legacy of empathy, respect, and the unwavering belief that real change begins with the smallest of actions. Years passed, and the changes Tara had brought to St. Augustine Medical Center became part of its foundation, a legacy that endured in every department, every corner of the hospital. The Respect First motto had evolved from a simple policy into a shared philosophy, a way of working and living that permeated the hospital's culture. Each new generation of doctors, nurses, and staff who joined the team embraced this vision, carrying Tara's ideals forward. Tara herself continued her work quietly, still the steady, humble presence she had always been. She had long since become a respected figure in the broader medical community, her name synonymous with compassionate leadership and inclusive reform. But Tara had never cared for the accolades or the attention. Her heart remained with her patients and her team, the people who had been the reason behind every step of her journey. One evening, as she sat in her office, the room bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, Tara found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of her first encounter with Dr. Hughes, his dismissive tone, the assumptions he'd made about her simply because of the uniform she wore. She remembered the boardroom confrontation, the ripple of change that had followed, and the quiet transformation of Hughes himself, once a man driven by ego, now one of her strongest allies in promoting the values they shared. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Dr. Hughes, now a close colleague and friend. "Thank you, Tara. I just spoke with a young doctor today who reminded me so much of myself." Arrogant, dismissive, thought he knew everything. I shared a bit of our story, how I learned that respect goes both ways. I wouldn't be the doctor or the man I am today without your influence. Tara smiled softly, feeling a warmth settle in her chest. She thought back to those days when Hughes had been one of her greatest challenges and how, through patience and resolve, he had become one of her most meaningful successes. As she looked out over the hospital grounds, watching the staff move through the corridors with purpose and camaraderie, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Each life she had touched, each shift in perspective she had encouraged, was part of a larger tapestry she'd helped to weave, a hospital where every person, from the janitors to the surgeons, understood their value. With a gentle sigh, Tara gathered her belongings and left her office, walking through the familiar halls one last time that evening. Her footsteps echoed softly, a comforting rhythm that reminded her of the countless days she had spent here. She passed by the nurses' station, where a new generation of nurses and doctors were laughing and working together, their respect and warmth evident in every interaction. As she reached the exit, she paused, looking back with pride. St. Augustine was no longer just a workplace, it was a community, a family. And in that moment, Tara knew that even after she was gone, her spirit, her values would live on through each person she had inspired. She had created something far greater than policies or practices. She had created a place where people truly cared, a place where every voice mattered. And so, as Tara stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a quiet peace settle over her, a sense of completion that filled her with gratitude. Her work here was done, but its impact would endure, carried forward by the people she had believed in, nurtured, and respected. Tara had given her heart to St. Augustine, and in turn, it had become her legacy. With one final look, she turned and walked away, knowing that the hospital and all the lives within it would continue to grow, shaped by the seeds of respect and empathy she had sown. And in that thought, she found her closure, the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and kindness.